Daphne Carlisle stood in the dark-floored, musty attic of her great-aunt Agatha's Victorian mansion and surveyed the remains of a life. Sunlight was edged with grime and cast long shadows through the room, whose rows of leather-bound books and flea market furniture seemed to moan softly in the gloom. Daphne was 30 years old and had not been expecting to receive anything when her only relative died, let alone an entire estate. Her fingertips raked across the spines of musty old books as she wove her way through the jumbled stalls. An expert antiques dealer, she was trained to detect the overlooked gems among the junk, but on this particular morning, it felt like an onerous duty. The weight of her latest troubles hung heavily on her shoulders. 3 months ago, she and her husband Gary had learned they would not conceive. Months of trying to conceive had brought no joyous results. An accident in her early 20s had left Daphne with scarred tissue inside her that would prevent her bearing a child. "It's one of those things you can't plan," she said of her accident. "You don't think anything's going to happen, and then it happens, and all your dreams of having your own children are gone." A frightening vacuum had opened up in their lives, and since then there was no way to plug it with joy. Her thoughts took a sudden turn, and Daphne nearly tripped over a large object shrouded by a frayed sheet. Puzzled, she gingerly peeled aside the covering to reveal a decorative mirror with entwining vines. The wood was carved and dark, its hidden faces and gnarled vines reminding Daphne of snake-like branches. Near the top sat a hideous face partially smothered by angle-toned wood. "What in the world?" Daphne murmured, leaning forward to peer at the workmanship. Despite its long neglect, the mirror was without a crack or even a smudge on its surface. It reflected the attic back to them as clearly as if it were a pane of glass, instead of slabs of warped wood and dusty lead. Daphne stared down into the mirror's surface. For a moment, there was something after her gaze, a shiver down her spine as she saw movement reflected back. But then, just as quickly, it went. She shook off the creepy feeling and carried the mirror out of its cubbyhole. She was unprepared for how heavy it turned out to be, and she grunted in effort as she carried it downstairs to the study. There, she set the mirror down atop an old desk and took a closer look. The mirror was difficult to pin down. In terms of style, it was obviously Victorian, but some parts were clearly much older than that. All of the detail had been carved. Daphne ran her fingers lightly over it, noticing the curiously stylized symbolism that must be hiding somewhere beneath the florid detailing. It could go for a lot of money in the shop, but something stopped her picking up the phone right away to set the ball rolling. As the afternoon continued, Daphne kept going to the mirror, its dead face alternately trying to catch her eye, looking away as if reconsidering its offer to show her something that would be just out of reach to her half-awake senses. Then, as the sun finally began descending to the horizon and its golden light began to infiltrate the windows, she saw herself not sad as she was now. Instead, Daphne saw that she was smiling and that for the first time in months, she was truly happy. And in her arms, she was holding a baby, turning its fingers into hers. Then, just as quickly as she'd seen it, the image vanished, and Daphne was left breathless and shocked. "How could it?" she whispered, putting a hand to her stomach. And yet, the thought had been so compelling, so tenable that she had hesitated before tilting the mirror. Daphne stepped away from it quickly, breathless. Perhaps she was losing her mind. Had she gone mad? This grief and frustration finally tipping her into insanity? Her cell rang, a screeching noise that made her jump in her seat. It was Gary wondering when she'd be home. Daphne checked the time and was startled to see that it had been hours since she discovered the mirror. "I'll be home soon," she promised, and left the house. She couldn't get the sight of her reflection out of her head, and as she lay next to Gary in bed that night, the vision began playing over and over in her mind. She didn't tell him what she'd seen. How could she, when she didn't know what it meant herself? But as she closed her eyes, the vision of what she saw in mirror was something right out in her dreams. That next morning, Daphne woke up with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. After kissing a groggy Gary goodbye, she jumped into her shop in a quest to answer her unsettling dreams once and for all. Daphne had gone into the antiques business. Her store, Timeless Treasures, was Daphne's pride and joy, located in the heart of the city's historic district, and a haven for collectors and history buffs alike. Opening the door, she was assailed by the musty smell of dusty books and freshly waxed wood. She walked to the back office and switched on her computer to start the search. She searched databases and obscure message boards for hours for any information about mirrors with predictions. What she found was, or mumbo-jumbo, nothing scientific enough to explain what she'd experienced. It wasn't until late afternoon that Daphne found a promising thread, a bulletin board for paranormal artifacts. Buried in a thread of years-old posts, she found something that sounded like her mirror. The post was ambiguous, a servant in a rich man's house, or so the writer claimed, after having found in his master's bedroom a mirror that foretold secrets. Once you asked the mirror, it would want the viewer to do something in return. Before Daphne could dig deeper, a customer entered the shop, and she shifted her attention. In between helping the old lady find a birthday present for her grandson, Daphne found her thoughts continually returning to the mirror. A part of her wanted to brush it off as some demented bereavement-based hallucination, but the other part, and this part grew larger with each passing minute, was convinced that she had discovered something remarkable. That night, when she closed up shop, Daphne drove back to her aunt residence, wrapped the mirror in blankets, and put in her car to take it home. At home, Gary raised an eyebrow as she hobbled through the house overburdened.
New purchase?
He teased, hurrying towards her to help. Daphne hesitated, then nodded. Something like that, she said. It was Auntie Agatha's. Thought you might want it in the spare bedroom. Gazing into her face, Gary felt sure there was more to the tale, but did not push, instead carrying the mirror up the stairs with her. As they uncovered it, Daphne watched her husband closely as he took it in. His eyes widened a fraction at the exquisite detail, but showed no sign that what stared back at him was anything other than a purely benign object.
Beautiful,
said Gary, running a hand along the frame.
Darn creepy, but still, your aunt had good taste.
Daphne forced a laugh, trying to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest. She had hoped that Gary would see what she saw, that the mirror would change, eloquent in his presence. She didn't know what that would mean, but she needed it to feel real. It was only after Gary had gone to bed that Daphne had returned to the guest room. She'd had to have been beholden to destiny's forces, the pull of the mirror drawing her back from the hallway. Her hand touched the knob. With her stomach aflutter, she waited. Hesitant, her fingers twisted the lock, and the hinges had stilled. The munificent face underneath the mirror's glass glimmered in the moonbeams that sneaked in through the window. How she craved and feared what she'd soon behold. At first, it was only herself of whom she saw an image. But then, there was an image of her surrounded by children, all of whom with her and her husband's features. They were their biological kids. As the vision faded, Daphne began to reach out toward the mirror to touch the glass. Then, she had an icy chill. A shiver ran down the back of her neck. There was something odd in the reflection. A shadow seemed to move behind her. She faced around quickly, seeing absolutely nothing. The room was empty, but still that spectral sense of another presence in which she tucked and concealed. Her heart pounding, she backed away from the piece, closed the door behind her, and slid back into bed beside Gary. The mirror had power, for better or for worse, and Daphne was not certain which. As she slept, she made a small vow to herself to find out all she could about the mirror. And once the gears of discovery got turning, she would take that journey to whatever lengths it required. She didn't know of the machinery on which her vow was clicking. Forces were already being activated that would push and pull on her imagination and shape her world in unimaginable ways.